Hey everybody, it's Pastor Lance back for another episode of Pastor's Bible Study. We're going line by line through the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 12 right now. You can jump in right here, or however you're watching this, you can go back to the very first episode and start from the beginning. Okay, so now Jesus is continuing to teach. He's physically located in the temple in the heart of Jerusalem, and that's very important for understanding not only what he's saying, but also why it's received the way it's received. Hear these words, chapter 12, verse 1. Jesus spoke to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a tower. Then he rented it to tenant farmers and took a trip. When it was time, he sent a servant to collect from the tenants his share of the fruit of the vineyard. But they grabbed the servant, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Again, the landowner sent another servant to them, but they struck him on the head and treated him disgracefully. He sent another one. That one they killed. The landlord sent many other servants, but the tenants beat some and killed others. Now the landowner had one son whom he loved dearly. He sent him last, thinking, "They will respect my son." But those tenant farmers said to each other, "This is the heir. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." They grabbed him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. So what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Haven't you read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it's amazing in our eyes. They wanted to arrest Jesus because they knew that he had told the parable against them, but they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. Okay, so when we're talking about the they there, we're talking about the people who lead the system of Jewish worship located in the temple. We're talking about the people who are in charge of the religious and spiritual life of the entire Jewish community, of the nation, of the faith. And that's the community to whom Jesus is speaking. They have an important responsibility of keeping the nation of Israel on the right track, of helping them live into their inheritance as God's chosen people. They've been given a specific role and specific privileges for the execution of that role. There's a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. And one of the things that Jesus is communicating to them is the way in which, for generations, people who have that responsibility haven't been fulfilling it. That's where this metaphor, this allegory comes into play. When he talks about the building of the vineyard, he's talking about the nation of Israel. That's a reference that comes from the Hebrew Bible. When he's talking about the vineyard owner, the landowner, that's God. And the people who are the tenant farmers, the people who are responsible for caring for the nation of Israel and its spiritual life, they don't own it, but they're responsible for it, are this priestly class, the people who've been given the sacred responsibility of leading the people in the right way so that they're fruitful and they fulfill God's purposes for the vineyard. Jesus is describing the way for generations people haven't been living faithfully into what they've been tasked by God to do. When he's talking about the people, the servants who are being sent on behalf of the owner, who are being rejected or even killed by the people who are responsible for making sure the land, the community of Israel is faithful, he's talking about the prophets, the people who've been sent with a prophetic word from God, God's word to God's world, who've been treated horribly by those who were responsible for listening to it. That's what's happening here, and Jesus is trying to make clear how it is that they have failed to live into their responsibility. Jesus is not only speaking about the past, however, he's also speaking about the future. Because in this allegory, the vineyard owner has servants that they've been sending, but then the vineyard owner ultimately sends his son, his beloved son, for the purposes of still straightening things out, restoring and having it be the way that it should be. Of course, in this allegory, we know that that son is Jesus. And Jesus knows in this moment what's going to happen to him. He tells it right there in the allegory. People with hardened hearts, people trying to preserve what they think they have for themselves, are ultimately going to lead to his rejection and his killing, his murder and his death. Jesus is making it clear that he understands in the telling of this story what's going to happen and the motivation behind it. And people who hear this are incredibly frustrated, right? They're angry at him. They realize that they're being undercut by him. But they also realize that he has a huge crowd of people around him. So the first thing they immediately want to do is lash out at him, to reject him, arrest him, kill him, something like that. But they can't because of the crowd. They're going to have to figure out another way to do it. Okay, so I want to pause for a moment of reflection here Whether you're watching this by yourself or listening to this by yourself on podcast, or whether you're part of a discussion group who uses this as a jumping off place for discussion, I want you to imagine, what does Jesus feel when he's sharing this story? What are the emotions that he's trying to relay, right? Because he's never just sanctimonious. Sometimes he has complicated emotions like anger and grief. What do you think he feels when he's talking to these people about the role that they're supposed to be fulfilling and the way in which they've fallen short, and ultimately what the byproduct of that is going to be in his own life? How do you think that he feels? Remember, Jesus is fully God and fully man, which is complicated church math, but one of the things that means is that he's experienced the full range of human emotion. So first, what kind of emotions do you think he's feeling? And second, what does it mean for you in your life of faith, knowing that Jesus has experienced those kinds of emotions? Does that make sense? How does that help you process your own emotional life, your own faith life, your own journey, knowing that the Lord to whom you pray and that you worship has actually experienced those same things? Okay, so whether you're discussing that live with a group or whether you're just pausing to reflect right now while you walk the dog, I hope that you jump back in now. We're going to be in chapter 12, beginning with verse 13, and we're talking about taxes. So let me jump in and I'll go back and do some teaching. They sent some of the Pharisees and supporters of Herod to trap him in his words. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you're genuine and you don't worry about what people think. You don't show favoritism, but teach God's way as it really is. Does the law allow people to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay taxes or not?" Since Jesus recognized their deceit, he said to them, "Why are you testing me? Bring me a coin. Show it to me." And they brought one. He said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" "Caesar's," they replied. Jesus said to them, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." His reply left them overcome with wonder. Okay, so on the face here, it seems like a pretty easy question about taxes and tax payment, but of course you realize there's a lot more context going on. So let me explain that to you here in a moment. So first, these leaders of the temple, the people whom Jesus has just deeply undermined and condemned with his teaching, want to do something about it. They want to stop him. And so they recruit some Pharisees, which is another group of teachers and leaders, and supporters of Herod. Now, remember, Herod is the client king who's ruling in parts of the kingdom, but he only has his power because it's been given to him by the Roman occupiers, right? So even though he's technically a Jewish king, he's not a representative of the Jewish people. He owes all of his allegiance and power to Caesar. And one of the things that happens in this community, because they are under the occupation of a foreign empire, is they have to pay incredibly high tax rates. And the taxes aren't for the building of their local public schools or their roads and infrastructures. It's for supporting the army that oppresses them and the outrageous lifestyles of the classes back in Rome and in their community who live these lavish lifestyles, while the people who are oppressed live at subsistence or below subsistence levels. In addition, one of the things that the people of Israel understand about themselves is that this land is ours, given to us by God. And so doing something like paying taxes to the oppressors is not only difficult economically, it's not only difficult emotionally, it's not only difficult socially, but it's also difficult theologically. Is this the right thing that we should be doing on behalf of our faith in God, they wonder? Or does this mean that we're giving up on believing that God would truly provide for us? Maybe if we just had more faith in God, God would give this land back to us, and maybe not paying taxes is the sign of what we should do. So in order to ask him these questions, they say things like, "We know that you're genuine and don't worry about what people think." Well, they're being sarcastic. They're being sarcastic. What they're trying to do is be sarcastic and catch him in the hot button issue of the day. What they're trying to do is to get him to say something about one of the most hotly debated issues of the day that will immediately cut his audience in half. Does that make sense? What do you think about issue A? Because your answer to this is going to mean that you alienate half the people that are listening to you. That's what they're trying to do to him in order to undermine him or catch him in saying something that's going to get him in trouble. This happens again in the next selection of verses. And so one of the things we need to understand is that when people attempt to trap Jesus in the hot button issues of the day, his answer reflects back that they don't fundamentally understand the true issues at hand. That's an important thing to realize. They're trying to catch him in a yes, no, left, right, liberal, conservative, something like that dichotomy. But when his answer back recognizes is, you don't really understand the fullness of what's happening in all of God's creation. And that's what happens here. Whose image is on the coin? They say. Caesar's. And Jesus said to them, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. It's important because in this moment in time, the people were living with the understanding that either we're faithful to God and believe that God will provide for us, or we're giving in to the people who've overrun us and we're paying taxes. They have the belief that their faithfulness is coming back to their response to a simple issue like this, right? And Jesus is separating those two things. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's. These coins with Caesar's imprint and face on them, whatever. Give to God what is God's. Your worship, your faith, your trust, your hope. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God's what is God's. What does that mean to you today? How does that impact you? And I want you to reflect on what are the most hot button issues of the day in which people might try to capture Jesus in our time. What are the things about which they would ask, trying to suss out, who are you exactly? You're on my side or their side? What are the questions that people would ask? And I wonder what kind of answers he might give that more than likely indicate the way that we're framing the question is much too small. That comes up in the next verse too. Let's read this, and it'll be an opportunity for us to continue to reflect. Sadducees, who deny that there is a resurrection, came to Jesus and asked, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a widow, but no children, the brother must marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first one married a woman. When he died, he left no children. The second married her and died without leaving any children. The third did the same. None of the 7 left any children. Finally, the woman died. At the resurrection, when they all rise up, whose wife will she be? All 7 were married to her. Jesus said to them, Isn't this the reason you are wrong? Because you don't know either the scriptures or God's power? When people rise from the dead, they won't marry, nor will they be given in marriage. Instead, they will be like God's angels. As for the resurrection from the dead, haven't you read in the scroll from Moses, in the passage about the burning bush, how God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? He isn't the God of the dead, but of the living. You are seriously mistaken. Okay, so remember the Sadducees, this group of people who's responsible for temple worship, are coming to Jesus, and there's a theological debate of their time. Is there a resurrection or not a resurrection? It's a really heavy theological debate of their time, and some people would believe yes, and some people would believe no. And so they're coming to him with this really convoluted question, right? You know how sometimes there's a debate over something, and people say, well, what about if so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so happened, right? They'll come up with a huge hypothetical, and in doing so, trying to illuminate issues with the problem at hand. And that's what's happening here with the Sadducees. They don't believe in resurrection. They don't believe that that's God's purposes for people. And in order to bring that up, they say, well, what about this incredibly unlikely scenario, right? Of a woman marrying 7 brothers and none of them having any children. And then, okay, well, they're resurrected. Well, then who's she married to there, right? Answer us that question. So they're trying to catch him in a silly situation with an answer that makes him sound silly. What Jesus says is point out the fundamental assumptions of what you're saying are flawed. They're not rooted in who God is or what God does. First, he says, you think your understanding of the resurrection is just like this life somewhere else, right? And he's pointing out that's not what you're resurrected to. This is a powerful image and something that's worth us digging into more at another time, but the image of the resurrection that Jesus gives is a new kind of life. Not just the more of the same life we've already had. You're resurrected into something that's new and different. He's pointing out, too, that their concept of, okay, dead and alive is completely wrong, too, because remember what God said to Moses at the time of the burning bush? I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's not saying I'm the God that they had when they died. He's saying I'm the God of them now. He isn't the God of the dead, but of the living. You're mistaken on all of this, about death, about resurrection, about what has happened, about what will happen. You don't understand God's fundamental act and posture towards all of you now. So your question not only doesn't make sense, it's kind of silly. I want to pause and remember that their purposes, the idea here was we want to catch him in something that makes him look silly. In reality, what they learn is, well, we actually don't understand what's going on here. I just want to pause right there. Instead of digging in deeply into the weeds of, okay, what do we think the resurrected life looks like? Because the true answer is we won't know until that time comes for us. The question instead is, what do we think we know so perfectly about faith? What do we think we perfectly understand? And in what ways might we actually have a vision that's just a little bit too small? What is it? What is it that we think we have a perfect understanding of, right? We really think we get, and we would be shocked to find out that God's world and Jesus' purposes in that world are actually much, much bigger. I want you to reflect on that, whether you're by yourself or with a group. Friends, I'm so thankful that you joined me for this time of Pastor's Bible Study, and I'll see you with the next one soon.